Dr. Will Flanders, by the way, from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. We're talking about return on investment for education. First of all, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Do you have a password strategy that you employ? We're just talking about passwords.
If anyone figures out what my one password is, they're going to be able to hack all of my accounts. I might want to change some of that.
You're one of those guys. So, Will, I was reading your report, and so much conversation about education now, right? Bang for the buck, or as you said, bang for the bucky, and how to match these things. So I'm just going to fire a couple questions at you. But first, let's set the table first. The cost of education is not going down. It's still going up.
Absolutely.
But the return on investment, people earning degrees, but then really matching what's needed in the workforce, that is a trend that's going the wrong way.
Absolutely. There's been a ton of discussion in the last couple years about student loan debt, right? And why are students racking up so much debt? Well, one reason is college has gotten more expensive. The other reason is that students aren't necessarily getting into fields where they're going to make sufficient income to pay off those loans. And so the argument we put forward in this report relatively recently was that if we're looking at the workforce needs of Wisconsin and we're looking at the same time for a solution to our student loan debt crisis, which I would agree is a crisis, the way to do that is to make sure that universities are getting folks into fields where they're actually going to make sufficient money to make the degree worthwhile.
This may seem like an obvious question, but do universities care about that, or they just want to educate students and probably on the fiscal side, they just want to take the money in?
Yeah, so I think that the main problem, right, is as long as the funding streams keep coming through, as long as they're still getting funding from the state, as long as they're able to keep tuition relatively high. Now, we have had a tuition freeze in Wisconsin for quite a while, but as long as the funding is still coming in, there's not a huge incentive to change. And what we've seen across the board in universities in recent years is that there's other incentives, the incentives to focus on DEI sorts of programs and things that are politically correct, things that are popular with the sort of liberal folks that tend to get into the educational field and into professorships, and that runs counter to what actually is needed in the workforce.
What would you say to people? I'll play devil's advocate here, that maybe college is more than just matching into the job you're going to get. Maybe it's trying to round that individual. That's the term, well-rounded individual. Give them a variety of opinions, although we could argue that's not happening.
Sure.
In universities. What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, I think we would never put forth that the only role of universities is to produce a good workforce for the state, right? The goal of universities and an effective education is to create someone who is exposed to a variety of different ideas, exposed to different philosophies, exposed to sort of a wide variety of people and people that come from different perspectives. That is an important role of the university, but you ought to be able to do that while you're still getting folks prepared for the workforce. And to the extent there's a disconnect there, that is a problem.
So you use the term ROI, return on investment, typically a financial term, right, used by businesses, but has it been used in education before?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the basis of this study was by an economist, national economist, and what he looked at was he created an ROI number for all university programs around the country, both at the 2-year and 4-year level. I think he was the first person to sort of introduce this concept, but we think it's very useful, particularly because with our public universities, obviously there's a huge taxpayer investment, and taxpayers should be getting something worthwhile for the amount of money that we're spending on the university system, and that's not always been the case in recent years.
And part of your study as well finds that technical colleges, and I've been saying this forever, they can really match. You're talking about workplace matches. My brother Bob came out of MATC and worked in a machine shop for forever. Now he's a supervisor. Still same place, same job. How often does that happen anymore? He found that match. They helped him find that match. That's an important link that I think tech schools have understood for a long time.
Yeah, what we found in this report is there are some tech degrees that aren't worthwhile, and those are the tech degrees that just are sort of a setup to go on to a 4-year college, because a lot of folks, sort of get lost in the stream. But if you focus on vehicle repair, if you focus on sort of HVAC sort of programs, you can set yourself up for a higher ROI than you can from any degree that you can get at UW-Milwaukee and other universities throughout the state as well. So if you focus on those important, skilled professions, you're really setting yourself up for success more so than you might do with a degree in anthropology from UW-Milwaukee or UW-Madison.
I know that it wasn't just you working on this report. I'm just looking at it. Corey Peterson, one of your writers and research analysts, also helped on the project. Let's talk about differences between universities. It does vary.
There are big differences across the board, and when we think about the number of programs that we're offering at state universities throughout the state of Wisconsin, I think there are important implications. Obviously, UW-Madison tends to go to the top in terms of ROI. UW-Milwaukee, you get a little more variation. There are some effective degrees you can get from there. Getting into financial things, getting into business, those can be effective degrees. Getting into healthcare. But when you go to the other end of the spectrum at a school like UW-Milwaukee, you're really looking at a negative ROI. So one of the degrees that you can get in area studies, which is sort of an ambiguous term that covers a number of different areas, has a negative ROI of almost $200,000. So you're better off in that case not going to college by about $200,000 over your lifetime. And if you go at the other end of the spectrum, you're at about $400,000 profit. So degree choice really does matter.
So if we're looking at universities in Wisconsin, I'm just looking at one of your default rate charts here. Bella Academy of Cosmetology, 28%. That's not good. Milwaukee Area Technical College, 14%. Cardinal Stritch, 4.9.
Yeah, there's and it's important to know with the technical colleges that are on there, right? A lot of that is to do with, again, those degrees where folks are trying to go on to a 4-year school. At the other end of the spectrum, you get much more positive results, but we have to admit those folks do exist in the system. But what we see with the beauty schools that come to the top, it really gets back to another topic we've talked to you about in the past, and that's occupational licensing.
Right.
The extent to which so many hours of training are required to get a beauty school or to become a cosmetologist in the state. Really means it's a big investment, and folks that fall through the cracks there or don't finish, they're setting themselves up with a lot of debt for a career that's not got a huge amount of return and income in most cases. So beauty schools were the worst schools in the state in terms of ROI, and it's largely due to those occupational licensing requirements.
What's the chances those will go away?
So it's an interesting question. I think there's always the entrenched interests who have the most incentive to spend time looking at these issues, and they're always there to lobby when the time comes. So it's a challenge, but at Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, we're going to continue to support reforms there, and it's an issue that ought to be bipartisan, right? On both sides of the spectrum, you ought to understand that getting folks into careers that can be meaningful and generate a good income for folks is a critical thing, whether you're left or right.
Where do other states fall on that? Are we kind of the norm? Is that the way they do it, or have they gotten away from that?
So there are some states that have had a pretty substantial occupational licensing reform. One of them is Arizona. There's been some really meaningful reform there. That's basically if you have a certification in any state, you can come to Arizona and work without any additional requirements. So I think we're pretty much in the middle, but that's just because a lot of states are still pretty bad in that regard. Though there are models out there like Arizona that are more effective.
So to kind of put a ribbon on this, we know that there's problems, especially when students are incurring tremendous amounts of debt to pursue degrees that probably aren't going to have a payday at the end of it. That's kind of always been obvious. I mean, you can love to dance, but the chances of you being a Broadway dancer or a ballet dancer at one of the premier places in the world are small.
Yeah, for anyone out there listening with kids looking at college, I would recommend not going into a dance program. That's the worst ROI degree in the state at a number of different colleges. But you're absolutely right. But I think what we can say is, for our public universities, right, that are taxpayer funded, we have a obligation to students to sort of push them towards degrees that are actually going to be beneficial in their lifetime. You tell 18-year-olds, what do you want to do for your career? And, we'd hope they have a great idea of what they want to do. But most of us, when we were 18, if we go back, really had no idea. So to the extent we can expose folks to that information and let them know what the return on investment's likely to be from different degree choices, we can sort of nudge people in a direction of choosing degrees that are better. And in the long term, for the university system, as kids drop out of those degrees and into more higher ROI ones, that changes the incentive structure for the universities as well.
There's no doubt in my mind that this kind of research on return on investment on your spending for your secondary education is going to start catching on, because I think parents understand, one, they don't want to spend money for something that's not going to be utilized, right? Or they want to give their kids a greater chance for success. So this kind of research, I think, kind of leads the way for parents, because ultimately this is a parent's decision. I know they consult with their kids, and kids certainly have a lot of sway in this, a lot of power in this. But I think parents ultimately can take them by the hand and say, this is where you should be going. This is what you should be doing.
Absolutely. And we do see that to some extent, right? We see that the college enrollments across the state are dropping, and that's just not a Wisconsin thing. That's a national phenomenon. Folks are learning more and more, like we've discussed, the tech colleges. Those can often be a better choice. And to the extent we can sort of change the mantra that everyone has to go to college, which has been sort of the narrative in the United States for really the last 60 or 70 years, to the extent we can change that, I think it's going to be better in the long run for young students that are moving on to the universities.
I know this is not popular, but when I was making this decision many years ago, I took a year off and worked full time and then went to school. And I chose University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which I could afford. I could have chose a lot of other schools that were a lot more expensive and maybe were more sexier, pick. But I chose one that I could afford and made sense for me, and I chose communications, and lo and behold, that's what worked out.
You made the right choice initially.
I guess
Right?
I
It worked
did.
out.
Will Flanders, PhD. Will Flanders, doctor. Great report. What's the name of the report again?
Bang for the Bucky.
Bang for the buck. Very clever.
Hope we don't get sued by
Not just a
UW.
smart guy, but a creative guy as well. And I always think when you come in studio, it's always fun to talk to you. Smart guys are fun to talk to.
I appreciate that. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Will Flanders, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. You can check out that great report. It is, I'll see if we can provide a link. Maybe producer Brandon can put one up for people. Read it. It is enlightening on the match between the things you decide when you go to college and the return on the investment when you get out. Thank you, Will.